interesting game to talk about. I actually mentioned the premise of this game to a friend of mine, and his immediate reaction was, "That's a Russian game, isn't it?" I said, "No, not quite Polish." Ah, okay. Leaning in that direction. This is a very, very smart game in many ways. While there are certainly game aspects of it, you can certainly meta several aspects of the game itself. The game is clearly designed to really service a story point. A lot of decisions are made with regards to trying to make you feel a certain thing. And I actually like that. I do want to address one concern that was actually brought up. Several people were like, is this game going to trigger you? Is this game going to trigger your depression? And it did not. I thought that was really weird, actually, because I kind of expected it to. I fully expected to go into this game and come out of it completely depressed. I didn't, because none of this hits what is depressing for me. It was very sad. It was very grief-stricken. It was very horrifying, but not depressing. So I do recommend this game. Let me start with that. Let's talk about something kind of weird. I like having a variety in my show. A lot of YouTubers out there that I've seen, and streamers as well, they tend to focus in on something that they're good at. And there's definitely something to be said for that, and that makes perfect sense. You're good at RTSs. You're good at, card games. You're good at MOBA games. You're good at MMOs. You're good at, whatever. Indeed, for a bit there, I was actually deliberately trying to be the MMO guy on my show, and that just kind of faded into the background, even though I still know a lot about it and can say a lot about MMOs. I don't really cover MMOs all that much, especially because my audience doesn't really care about MMOs that much, or at least that's what I've heard. So, one of the things I like about the fact that you guys get to pick what I ruminate on, and I don't, is the fact that I get to hit a huge variety of games. There's a pretty good chance that I would have never played this game if not for the fact that it was requested for Rumination. This isn't the only game like that. It's just, especially this month in particular, we're hitting just kind of a random grab bag of games that I would probably have never played if not for the fact that they were requested for Rumination. This is just another one. So I like that variety. I like trying to cover a wide gamut of things. I don't want to just focus in on the big RPGs or the big action games or the big story stuff. I want the whole gamut. Let's talk about the appeal of war in writing, or from a writer's perspective. Because the thing that's interesting about war is probably one of the, I don't mean this as an insult, most obvious things to write about, because it has such an impact on everything. Like, obviously you can write about a war and the armies and the nations and the kingdoms and all that, or you could write about a war and the cities and how the cities are changed and all that, or you can write about a war and how it affects culture and society and civilization, or you can write about war and how it affects a family and the brothers going off to war and the sisters going off to war and the parents being left home alone. Or you could write about war and how it affects your friendship, and your friend ends up on the other side of the line, or your friend dies in the middle of combat or whatever. Or you can write about war and how it affects you as an individual, and you in your personal life actually changes. You get my point. It hits every single level of human existence, from all the way up to civilization, all the way down to an individual. And so it's obvious why people like and enjoy writing war stories. This is, of course, this is not saying anything new, but this is one of the more unique takes on a war story that I've seen recently, because the whole point of this is set from the perspective of the individual. Now, granted, you have a team, but the point is the individual down, ground level perspective, viewpoint of what's going on in a war from this perspective of someone who's not involved in the war, from the perspective of a civilian, someone who has no war training. This is not a coming-of-age story. This is not a loss of my friend story. This is not a war as hell story in any of the traditional senses of the words. Now, it's not like this is a completely unique thing. Other works of fiction have examined this as well. But this is a very well-done treatise, overall, in my opinion, of the idea of being a normal person in the middle of a battle zone. Now, the developers have made some comments for and against this. For me, this is absolutely the Sarajevo incident. The 4-year incident. Actually, I wrote down the day. 1,425 days is how long that lasted. And, during the Bosnian crisis, or conflict. I want you to picture that for just a moment. 1,425 days. I actually found a few tidbits from developers saying that they had originally planned to have the duration of this game be much longer due to that 1,400-day thing, and it was just infeasible. And I agree with that, having played the game several times uh, myself. Yeah, but the point is, you're just a guy. It's kind of everything that tends to be why the zombie apocalypse scenario storyline still exists, despite being overplayed to hell and back, despite the fact that everyone has done a take on, zombies have invaded, and oh god. Because in the middle of a zombie invasion, everyone has the chance to be a hero, to actually accomplish something other than their ordinary, mundane, everyday life. It's a form of wish fulfillment, the desire, the intention, the chance to rise up and be more than just the guy, right? The ordinary, normal guy who, honestly, if you asked anyone outside of circle of friends or her circle of friends, they would have no idea who that person is. You know what I mean? I've also heard the concept that certain stories tend to be written as if this is what we hope we would be like if we were in those dire circumstances, because dire circumstances are dire, and believe it or not, it's not that easy. Like in fiction, so often if you refuse to rise up and sacrifice of yourself and be the hero, then you're seen as a coward. But the reality, and few fictional works accomplish this, DS9 did this, for example, over in Star Trek, the reality is more like most people aren't going to do that because most people are, bear with me now, normal people. And that's not a bad thing. It's just most people aren't willing to go through that kind of hell and nightmare. Most people don't have that kind of emotional and mental fortitude to be able to stand up against absolutely atrocious situation and try to rise up against it. That's not how that usually works, right? So here we are playing completely ordinary people, trying to do the most difficult thing of all, survive. Now let me answer a question you guys are probably going to have. No, I never made it. I played the game several times, 5 times. I wrote it down, made a check mark for each attempt. And I want to talk about that a little bit really quick here. This is actually a roguelike. It took me till my second attempt, about halfway through my second attempt, to really slot it in. I was like, this is a roguelike. Now, I'm not saying that as an insult. It just kind of make so much sense. For those of you not aware, just look up roguelike. I'm not going to describe the genre. But if you ever played FTL, that's another good, very popular example of a roguelike. I want to say a quick aside really quick about roguelikes. I usually don't like roguelikes. Like, it is not a genre I am a fan of. There are extremely few roguelikes I praise. In fact, there's only really 2 that I've ever really enjoyed personally. Not counting NetHack. Played the heck out of NetHack. Those 2 would be Rogue Legacy and the aforementioned FTL. Both of them are very well crafted games, but the problem that this game has is that it is very similar to FTL, both in the good and in the bad. The good is obvious, very well crafted, very well designed, lots of variety, lots of complexity, lots of RNG, lots of different ways the story can unfold, etc., 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 like a good roguelike should. Here's the bad. The problem FTL has, and this is actually my biggest complaint about FTL, is it's a roguelike that tries to pretend it isn't. And so it takes quite a while of going into the roguelike before it becomes obvious that you're screwed. Like, it is possible to get to a certain point in FTL, in any roguelike really, and have an incompletable save, just because of RNG and nothing else, or because of the choices you make as you go. And so usually in a roguelike, you just smash the reset button, or die and reset because of that, and there you go, you're good. In FTL, that process takes a while to get to that point where you're like, oh, I'm screwed, well now I gotta reset. It's a slow build in a roguelike, which is kind of weird. And I found myself thinking this here on about my 3rd or 4th playthrough. It's like, can I just skip through the first few days? I know how the first few days are going to go. There's like no variation, really, in the first few days. I'd really like to just get to it, you know what I mean? Hang on just a second. Pardon me. So, that is probably my single biggest complaint about this game overall, is that restart time. If I had the ability to set up saves, that would be fixed by itself, because I just go through the first few days, save, and then, continue forward in my particular scenario. Of course, no saves is part of the point, isn't it? The fact that this is a game that has a deliberate lack of a tutorial, because the whole point is to try to emphasize that you are a normal person in the middle of an atrocious situation, so you have no idea how to deal with it. I freely admit it actually took me a little bit to really figure out how to use the game and what icons meant what, with the total lack of tutorial, but I will say also in the game's defense that it only took me like 10 minutes to really have slid in and be comfortable playing the game. So that's some good UI design overall, or UI design. I know some of you hate it when I say UI. The the other thing that I really tend to like about it is the fact that once you... The visual design is fairly distinct. Like, most of what you need to do is just immediately visually apparent. And even if it's not immediately visually apparent, and there were like a couple cases where I was like, what's that icon mean? The moment I started interacting with it, it became very obvious. Like, oh, okay. And then I died. I wrote a journal, by the way. I didn't actually write it. I wrote bullet points, and I'm going to share that with you towards the end here of my experiences here. The one that really threw me, the one that actually killed me that I just referenced, was actually the stealing icon. It was a little hand going like this, and I'm like, what the heck is that? Okay, I'll interact with it. Hey! One game I'm actually reminded of a lot in this game with regards to roguelikes is actually Darkest Dungeons. I actually did an exploration on that game. It was a good game. Very well crafted, very, very hard. And that's kind of the point, isn't it? This game does not pull its punches in any meaningful fashion, nor should it, if I'm being blunt. Again, this is a game trying to get across a point and trying to serve a function rather than just be a game. But I did find myself eagerly wanting to get back to it. I was actually having way more fun with this game than I thought I should. Take of that what you will. I do know some people have complained about the fact that the debuffs, for lack of a better term, the status effects, are actually blatantly visible on the character's cards. Some people think that that shouldn't be there at all. Like, I've actually heard the thought, and I heard it discussed on several Reddit threads about the idea that maybe you should just have no information at all. You don't know if they're sad. You don't know if they're hungry. You don't know if they're tired. You don't know if they're depressed. You don't know if they're suicidal. And so you just kind of have to assume and figure that out on your own. And they point out, and I actually agree with this, it's kind of obvious to figure out what's what. I mean, they will say, I'm hungry, or I'm tired, or stuff like that. So it's not like it's hard to figure out what's going on with the characters' minds. And they feel that would have been a more dimorphic experience than just having a thing that says, I am sad. Didn't bother me personally, but I thought I'd discuss it. For those curious, obviously I got the Pavel, Bruno, and Marco scenario. I actually deliberately went out of my way to just do that scenario for the first 4 playthroughs, and then I just did a random one on the 5th one. I actually got 4 people. That was actually very difficult. But I do find the way that they interact with each other interesting, and the various scenarios themselves are interesting. There are apparently quite a few, actually. I've looked into that. So there's a lot of replay value in the fact that you get different people with different abilities and different addictions. That's a big problem. What's his name? Bruno was a smoker, and I almost never had cigarettes, so he was almost always just not doing well as a result of that. I also really like the fact that you can set up your own if you choose to, and of course there are mods. You can mod in new characters if you feel like it. When I started off the game, there's a quote. I'm paraphrasing. You will die like a dog for no good reason. Now, the quote was, in a modern war, you will die like a dog for no good reason. I got rid of the in a modern war because it would be more accurate to say, in a war, you will die like a dog for no good reason. That is a very apt quote. That quote pretty much summarizes everything that needs to be said about this game in a nutshell. You will die like a dog for no reason. Yeah. I don't know what else to extrapolate from that. That is the point in many ways. Simple survival became something of an equation for me in this. And that leads me to my next big point I want to talk about. I've talked many, many times about the difference between survival and living. In my own personal thinking, I actually think of it as a 3-tier gradient. There's survival, existence, and living. Living being the top, survival being the bottom. And there's also a 2-fold quote that was said recently on Mankind Divided, I believe, which I very much agreed with, which is basically, you cannot live unless you first survive, but survival without living is equally meaningless. In other words, you need both, right? And I liked that, and it made perfect sense. This game, more than anything, brings up the question of survival versus living, because it's absolutely no denying that none of these people are living at the state they're at within this point in time, especially if this is happening towards the end of the siege. This has been happening for a while. The question, there's so many moral questions that come into place. It's one of those things, if you just play this as a video game, if you are just interested in surviving, this is actually probably a very easy game. I know that sounds weird, but as long as you just do not care about, morality or ethics, or should we survive? Should we keep going? Is it worth doing horrible things to survive for the hope of living? Mathematically speaking, that would be true. But people will tend to question things like, if I did horrible things just to survive, do I deserve to survive? Do I deserve to live after having successfully survived, when the siege ends? Is this something that should happen? Do I deserve it? Maybe I should, recompense. Maybe I should have penance. All these moral gray gradients in between kind of murky the water a bit. And I like that. That's kind of one of the main points of the game, is that, what are you willing to do to survive? I'll never forget one key point where I had basically just gotten to the point where I was doing pretty well. And then the fighting intensified, and all the places I was going to go interact with that had, that I hadn't gone to yet, suddenly were inaccessible. And so the only places I could go to was a place I had 100% cleared out, a place that I had 87% cleared out, and an old family. An old man and his wife. And that was it, and I had no food. At what point is surviving still worth it? I think this is probably one of the reasons that this game didn't trigger any depression in me, because to me, that's an answer I've already answered in my real life. I've already got that. I know exactly what I do in Fake Town, whatever they called it in this one. And so that's something that I don't even have to question. It reminds me in many ways, though, of... I know I keep referencing this darn book, World War Z, because it's funny how things just change when you get into a survivalist situation. I mean, I've used myself as actually an example of this before. My real life self, I would probably not survive in a survivalist. Zombies invaded. If we had the Cetus area over here in my Fake Town where I live, then it is actually extremely likely that I would die. I don't serve a meaningful function to society. I am not physically well. I have health and issues. I need glasses just to be able to see, for God's sakes. I am not what you'd call a useful unit of currency for a society to function when all that is being considered is base survival. Make sense? And there's tons and tons of people who probably have to ask the same question of themselves. Infamously in World War Z, I don't remember the specifics, but there's someone who goes and tries to find commercials for flagging or something like that. There's some IP stuff. He was like a copyright lawyer kind of a guy, and his job was ludicrously irrelevant in the world that World War Z had become. And we kind of see this in some of the survivors. We get to see what they were before. The idea of a chef, well, that's actually something very useful. The idea of a fireman, well, that's something that's actually very useful. The idea of someone who is a football star, well, that actually still has some use, admittedly. But the idea of watching other people play sports for fun is just kind of one of those things that kind of becomes alien when you haven't eaten for 2 days and you haven't slept for a day and you just got attacked by other people. You get my point, right? It's interesting how the perspective shifts, and I think that's one of the appeals, and I mentioned this earlier, with this style of writing that leads to the zombie apocalypse thing. How completely different our viewpoint is when all of a sudden tomorrow isn't a guarantee. And it's interesting too, the trade mechanic. I know you guys know me. I'm huge about economics and trade in general. The trading mechanic in the game was something that I quickly just grasped onto. I'm sure I'm not the only player that did, because the idea is that certain things simply have more intrinsic value when it comes to a survivalist society like this. And so going out of your way to procure just those things of value, and then deliberately using those to trade. That's actually my 5th playthrough, which is the one I got the farthest on. Or excuse me, my 4th playthrough. Maybe it was my 5th. It was the last playthrough I did. It had to be 5th. The last playthrough I did, I just finished earlier, the one I got the farthest on, I actually used that strategy. I had, methods of procuring meat, rat traps basically, but the majority of my food intake was from Marco and from other people I would trade with, because I would deliberately go out of my way to produce alcohol and to produce tobacco and all that fun stuff to sell in order to procure food. And it worked until one little incident. I'll discuss it later. I'll give you the play-by-play later. Anyways, but again, this brings to mind the question of, at what point, because there's no rule here. There's no hard set written into stone, this is what is acceptable to survive. Let me segue for just a second. In Star Trek, there's actually a rule that's quoted in the episode Equinox. I'm going to misquote it here because I don't remember it word for word, but under the dire dangerous situation, a captain is willing to is allowed to take any and all circumstances necessary to safeguard the life of his crew, right? Now, the funny thing about that to me is that is a hard and set rule that says anything you do is acceptable. If you want to go and start cannibalizing the crew in order to get to survive, that's totally cool. And other horrible, despicable acts, it's totally cool because survival matters. And there is a reason for that to be a rule, because from a purely mathematical perspective, that is the logical thing to do. You, from a purely mathematical perspective, from cold calculus, you should survive. You should do everything in your power to survive, even at the expense of others' survival. And that because, and the reason this is a logical thing is not because survival matters, or we're not getting into questions of life and what life means or anything like that. It is solely because of the fact that you are more likely to then be able to give back, contribute to society, and otherwise accomplish things if you survive. Because if you're dead, this isn't like Warcraft where you can get back up. No, you're dead. You're gone. So logically speaking, for the chance of being able to accomplish more, you should presume such a thing and accept your own biological imperative to exist. But of course, ethics, morality, concepts of deservation, concepts of the soul, all these things that are ill-defined and disagreed upon are where things actually get murky. Muddled, murky. I tend to combine words like that. Murkled. Suddenly you're all murlocs. I've been playing Legion lately. What do you want from me? At what point is it acceptable to go ahead and just say, I'm going to steal from an old man and his wife? They aren't even going to fight back. I'm just going to steal all their food. At what point would it not be more merciful to just put an axe into their heads, rather than condemning them to starve slowly? Let's move on from that topic. Let's talk about, let's keep going with this a little bit. Let's talk about the difference between altruism and the opposite of altruism. Now, very recently, I actually did a rumination on Puella, Magic, and several people actually commented on it, saying that they didn't believe altruism exists and they believe selfishness is inherently human. I, of course, disagree with this, but they made a well-reasoned point, and a lot of people have disagreed with this topic in the past. But the point here that I'm making is not, altruism as a generic, vague, textbook kind of a concept. I mean in the literal cooperation sense of the word. One of the things I found interesting is that I never had the issue of someone betraying the group. That is something that apparently can happen. They can just betray the group and leave and take a bunch of stuff with them. I only know that because I read it in the wiki after I finished playing, when I was doing research for the game. But for the most part, cooperation is the name of the game. And we see this actually in several cases. Several people are willing to cooperate with others because they know that their chances of survival increase when they're working together with someone else. And I find that perspective fascinating because I personally think that to be true in general concept. What would you rather have? A survival of the fittest situation where we're all basically Sith? Or would you rather have people who are coordinating to each other, even though we're all not getting every piece of the pie, we're getting something, and thereby increasing all of our chances of survival? To give you a direct example, see, neither of these is actually right, though, in a survivalist situation. That's kind of the point I'm actually leading towards. You can be someone who helps others and is helped in return, or you can be someone who takes from others and is helped as a result of doing so. And both of these strategies are perfectly valid. There are consequences to both of these strategies. The former leaves you more vulnerable, and the latter leaves you more likely to basically self-destruct. As it starts to eat away at your humanity. I have the horrible thought as I was going through this, of how much easier it gets to cheat or steal or kill the more you do it. A very Undertale kind of perspective. Personally, I went with the overall cooperative perspective, except for one particular playthrough, which again I'll talk about later. But I just wanted to bring this topic up. I don't actually have much else to add to it because I've already given my opinion on it. I think that in a survivalist situation, people working together with their given skills, trying to share the burden, increases the odds of survival for each individual person in addition to the group as a whole. That's the perspective I have on that. Rather than, every man for himself, dog eat dog. Again, it's the Sith mentality. except to a less severe extreme. I mean, the Sith mentality taken to its logical extreme leads with one extremely powerful Sith on top of an empire of corpses, Whereas the cooperation thing leads to a lot of alive people, and you get the point. Not that there aren't downsides to the cooperation thing as well. I kept waiting for people keep showing up, please help me with such and such. I kept waiting for that to just bite me in the ass. And it technically did a couple of times. Because the greatest flaw in doing that is that it takes from your resources, your time, and your capacity. Every time I lose a person for that night. So I basically can't go scavenging that night. So I am now down resources for having helped that person. Furthermore, when that person gets back, they are completely out of it for a whole day. They are very hungry, so they take up more food than they otherwise would have, and they are very tired, so they have to sleep all day. So I have just taken a severe hit to my overall mathematical survivalist ratio, or whatever you want to call it, in exchange for the fact that I helped them. However, each time I helped them, it did actually give me something. It wasn't something that was like equal trade, but it was something, and in several cases that actually helped me. I actually got, for example, some shotgun shells, or some ammo, as a result of doing that, and that was invaluable in that particular playthrough. And another time I got basically nothing. Because that's how that works, right? One of the things I want to talk about this game is that it is obviously depressing. Or I shouldn't say depressing, because obviously, as I said, it did not depress me. It's obviously sad, it's obviously grief-stricken, it's obviously horrible. There's not really a lot of subtlety in the way it approaches its overall setting of how horrible things are. It's pretty much blunt and in your face. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It is probably... I've talked with a couple friends of mine about this, and by a couple I mean actually 5. 2 of them had the same reaction. They felt like the game was a bit too overt. The game basically has a giant mallet here that just says, be sad, and it whaps you over the head with it. It does work. It hits its point very hard and very unforgivably. It does not at any point try to hide or to shake or anything about it. And yet, at the same time, some people feel maybe they should have tried to be a little more subtle about it. Again, this kind of goes back to that mood thing I mentioned earlier. I will say there is one scene that was definitely subtle. I was very tense going through this game. I'm actually going to share a story about that later. It's funny because from my perspective, I just recently played Alien Isolation, and going straight from that to this game, the similarities between the two are actually stark. But there's a lot of tension anytime you go out to a new scavenging place you've never seen before, especially for someone like me who's never played this game before, so I know nothing about this new place I'm going to, and I'm like, what's that? Oh my god, what's this? And then I see a soldier who is attempting to force himself upon a woman, basically, to coerce her at gunpoint to go into a shack, and you understand the rest of that. Now, the thing is, that is obviously horrifying. The subtle part, this is really subtle, is the fact that you don't have to do anything to stop him whatsoever. In fact, there's basically no real benefit from stopping him. You can just sit there and watch him cart her off as property and do whatever horrible things he's going to do to her at gunpoint, and just go on about your business. I mean, the only gameplay detriment you lose there is the fact that you lose access to his gun. Now, it's a very nice gun, and you'd be very well suited to get that gun, but you get the point, right? And then you can just loot the supermarket at will, and there's tons and tons of stuff there. It's tons of food. It's a veritable gold mine of resources, and very, very useful. Now, here's the funny thing. So that's the first half of why that's so subtle. The second half of why that's so subtle is I went to YouTube to try and find people who didn't save her, just because I could not bring myself to do it myself. And apparently, basically, no one else could either, except for one guy. I found one guy, and I actually found him linked on a Reddit thread who basically refused to help the woman. One person. This is the other half of the subtle thing. This is why I consider this game a success. Because despite the fact that we get basically no real gameplay benefit other than the gun, and of course, you get like a morale boost, a karma boost if you help her out, but that's not even visible in the gameplay, so unless you know about that, you're just, eh. And I didn't even know about the karma thing until I looked at the wiki afterwards. So unless you know about the karma thing, unless you're after the gun, there's no benefit to stopping that man. And yet everyone tries to, except for that one guy. Everyone tries to. I actually talked to a few friends of mine who've played this game. They all were like, of course I tried to stop him. Everyone tries to stop him because what he's doing is horrible. it's so natural for us, the players, to look at that and say, that's wrong, and to approach it. And there's whole strategies for, okay, all I have is a knife. How can I stop him? All I have is a hatchet. How can I stop him? I approached this once with just my fist. Is it still possible to stop him? Yes, it is. You just have to do it at this time. There are strategy threads for taking out this guy, so he can't do anything to her. I love that, first of all, but that's why it's so subtly horrifying. Because we have been presented something that basically none of us can say no to, except for the one guy. I'm sure there are other players who don't try to stop him. But overall, the attempt is made. I don't know how to put this properly. It's using the obvious to accomplish the subtle. It's like Grand Theft Auto 4. Something that was so blatant and overt that most people miss the subtlety it's actually sliding under the rug. There's something terrible and horrible just flashing with giant neon lights in your face, and yet the subtle implication there is that there is no reason to do this unless you care about living more than survival. Think about it. Also, the brothel. I never encountered that myself. I only read about that on the wiki. Let's go to my journal here really quick. I only have a few bullet points, but I want to share a couple stories with you, if that's okay with you. Because I'm kind of done talking about the game. So, my first thing, I was doing great. I was doing absolutely amazing. It's fantastic. Then I got raided, and they took all my food and all my water. All of it. And I'm like, okay, that sucks. So I had Marco, of course, my key scavenger. I sent him out. Got to the this one place. I can't remember the name of the building. I went to this place, and I'm like, okay, this is a steal situation. They won't barter with me, so I have to steal food if I'm going to survive. Swallow the pill. I'll go ahead and steal from these people. And I actually tell myself I'm not going to take all their food, just enough to survive in order to get things going, right? So I get in there and I get shot. Marco's dead. I'm like, okay. Well, next night I'll go ahead and send Bruno out. Bruno, same place, gets shot, like within 5 feet of Marco's corpse. At that point, I decided that Pavel went out and got shot as well. The end. So that was the end of my first playthrough. Second playthrough, I'm like, okay, I've got a little better of an idea what I'm doing here. Let's go ahead and push forward. I had this very tense moment that I wanted to share with you. I'm going through this place, and there's one of those little red indicators that shows you hear something, and I'm like, oh god. Because I had no weapons at this point in time. I had no anything. I had my fists. And I'm like, okay. Sneak. And I'm just like very carefully sneaking around this red dot, trying desperately not to interact with it, until finally it's like an approach, and I'm like, crap, I have nowhere to go, and I don't want to run. And it's a rat. It was just a mouse. But you can't imagine the tension I was having. This goes back to that tension thing I mentioned earlier with the Alien Isolation Parallel. I'm like, oh god, what is it? It's a mouse. Oh, thank god. Now the funny thing was, right after that feeling of relief was, wait, can mice attack me? Because mice bites are no small issue when you're in that kind of medical environment. But they can't, so I was okay. So things were going pretty well in my second playthrough, and then I got all my food and water robbed again. And then they starved to death. One of them actually committed suicide. Couldn't get any more food. I could not get any more food. Third playthrough. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. We had a situation where some kids showed up asking for medicine for their mother. Now, this reminds me of a real-life story I want to share with you, because I had no medicine. Like, I would have given them the message like that if I could, but I didn't have any. It reminds me of a situation that happened in my real life. Forgive me for getting a little bit real here, but I used to live on the street. It wasn't for a long period of my life, but I have been homeless. I have actually lived in a gutter. And I remember one night, like it was yesterday, there was a cat that came up. And this cat was emaciated, very, very, obviously some kind of house cat that didn't actually know how to fend for itself properly, and had no ability to procure food for itself, and was starving, and desperately was pawing at me, because it knew to ask for food from humans. I didn't have any food. I couldn't eat myself, let alone give any food to the cat. The cat didn't leave for like a full day. I'm talking like a full 24 hours. And he or she, I don't know, they just kept staying there, desperately meowing pitifully, begging me for food. And I offered scritches and I offered comfort, but I had no food to give it. That's kind of how that one felt for me. When these kids show up, it's like, please help us, mister. I can't. This is pretty much the exact opposite of the power situation I keep referring to in many of my ruminations, many of my streams. You know, power being the ability to help others, powerless being the inability to help others, or yourself for that matter. In that particular playthrough, I didn't know what rat traps were. And so I was having some pretty serious issues getting food. You'll notice this is a recurring theme. And I'm like, okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to go to the supermarket. This was my first encounter with the supermarket, rapist situation. I went up and I see what's happening, and I put it together. And of course, like I said earlier, there's no question in my mind I'm going to stop this guy. And so I charge forward and managed to injure him pretty well, and then get shot. Next night, I immediately send someone else and get shot. Third night, I send someone else and get shot. So that was my third playthrough. My fourth playthrough went really badly. Like, really, really badly. I had some very bad RNG. Usually the shelter gives me enough supplies to get a lot of things going. And this time, I don't know, I just drew the short straw. I had nothing. I had nothing to trade. I had very few components, so I'm like, okay. So I go out to the safe house. There's always one safe house. It's a good gameplay mechanic, by the way, for two reasons. I'll talk about that in a moment. I go to the safe house, get some materials, come back, try to build some things, get robbed in the middle of the night, lose all my components. Now I can't build anything. I still have no food. Go out to another place, and I'm like, okay, I desperately need food. And the new place I went to turned out to be a military facility. And basically by accident, I didn't really understand the rules of how this worked gameplay-wise. I ended up trespassing into the military base. It wasn't even a military base. It was like a place the military were occupying. So they shot me dead, and end of the fourth save. I want to talk about that subtle thing really quick. So first of all, it makes perfect sense from a gameplay perspective to have the difficulty ramp up, right? So the fact that you have one safe place you can scavenge from, and there's like no threat at all from scavenging there, is a good thing to ramp up the difficulty. The other reason it's a good thing is because it means at first you start to feel comfortable. You start to feel like you don't have to make any moral choices or hard choices or ethical things, because at first you're not stealing from anyone, you're not hurting anyone, you're not killing anyone, you're just scavenging from ruins. Then that place runs out of supplies. Now, in my fifth playthrough, this was most blatant. In my fifth playthrough, I had the safe house, and then nowhere else was safe. Everywhere else was somewhere place which I had to either steal from or kill from in order to get, and I'll describe the difference in a minute. So, it's like, okay then, immediate jump from that. But again, that gets the point across, because you start to get comfortable and relaxed, and then you realize you can't just play it safe anymore. And the funny thing is, after that it gets worse too, because then the fighting happens. I mentioned that, and it cuts off certain areas. And then after that, winter happens, and things get even worse. I'll go and give away the information finally. Day 19, that's as far as I ever got on my fifth playthrough. Day 19. Go ahead and make fun if you want. There's 45 days in this scenario. So, going through the day 19 scenario, the last scenario I did, it was actually much more informed this time. I had a plan of action. I knew where I was going for. I needed wood. I needed components. I needed gears. I got a rain distiller, to get some water. I got a rat trap, and I had a moonshine, because I got tons of sugar, in order to get resources to sell, in order to get food. I had all sorts of things ready to go. I had a plan of action in mind and everything. I got to one particular night, and this was a night when everyone was already very hungry, because we simply had no food. I was working on other things, and I simply had no food in any of the safe places, so I had to go to one of the places where I have to steal to get food. So I go to this homeless place where there's a whole bunch of homeless people. They're not hostile. They don't interact with me. They're just there. And I scour the place, and I'm running out of time, because you only have so much time in the night. And I get to the end, and there's these two people who are sitting on the only supply of food in the whole place. They're talking about their stash, and I'm like, oh, God. Marco kills these two people. He kills these two homeless people in order to steal their food. And it was personally, it was actually a big bite the bullet kind of a moment, because you know me, and I tend to try and play the Mario. So this was just, the alternative here was just dying. We were already very hungry, and I've seen what happens at that point. I've already had that happen. So we're like, ugh. So he kills the two people. He's got a hatchet. I knew a hatchet was a very useful tool at this point. So, hatchet, crunk, crunk. No issues, no danger. Didn't even get wounded. And then he checks their stash. They had no food. He just murdered two people for nothing. Now, by absolute luck, the next day Franco, came by and had food for sale, and I had gotten stuff from the homeless shelter to barter, so thank God. But, yeah, he killed two people for no reason. They died like a dog for no reason. The next night, food is still, of course, a very severe issue, so it's like, okay, there's literally only one other place on my map to go to at this point. And it's a place where an old man and an old woman live. And they are not hostile at all. In fact, the old man just kind of follows you around as you rob him. And he begs you, don't take that, please don't take that. Like, if you take valuables and stuff, he'll just be like, If you take anything survival related, like food or water, he says, no, please, you need to leave us at least something. And I'm like, and this is just destroying me. And it gets to the point where basically I make the decision, Marco's going to leave them enough to survive. So he's just going to take what we absolutely need, which is, this and this and this and this. So we take, the few resources that are required and then book it and never actually go back to the old people's house. Marco comes back despondent. He actually has the status effect of broken. It gets to the point where he won't eat, and I have no control over him from a gameplay perspective. So, now this was funny to me because Bruno had to talk him out of it, because Pavel was busy with other things. This amuses me because Bruno was clearly the cynic of the group. Pavel was clearly, a hot-headed, emotional person. Marco was the emotional, ethical, he was a fireman, for God's sakes. He cared about people. So having Marco steal from that old couple just destroyed him. Bruno was the cynic, the person who thinks, I don't care how those goods show up, as long as they show up. He actually said that in one of his journal entries. I don't, as long as we get supplies, it's what has to happen. This is a survivalist situation. So he's the guy who ends up comforting Marco over the next several days to try and pull him out of his stupor, feeding him with all the food we stole from those people. Fortunately, at this point, I had a rank 2 stove. And, of course, Bruno's a good cook. And I had tons of water coming in, and the old people had lots of food. So we actually have a good situation for one. It's like, oh my God, we're actually doing well. And we had basically just reached the point where, I'd gotten Marco talked out of it. We actually went and helped out one of the neighbors, and that ended up boosting everyone's morale and helped bring Marco out of broken into merely depressed so he can actually function again. Everything started going well. That's when the fighting hit. I've referred to this several times. And all of a sudden, the places I was going to hit, that I had planned to hit, I couldn't. And all of a sudden, I basically have nowhere to scavenge, except for this one place. And I'm like, okay, I'll go to that one place. Now, what happens next, I still don't 100% understand what happened. I have a theory about it. But Marco is scouring through the under area of this thing. Now, I know at this point what the steel icon is, and everything up top is steel icon. But there's lots of loot down below that is not. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go down there. I'm not going to steal from these people. It'll be cool. And I dig my way through the terrain, and I start taking some stuff, and I'm getting some really good finds down here. And then a guy shows up and says, hey, get out here. I didn't even see him. He already has his gun out. I can presume, because of the camera angle, that he probably heard me and probably had the text bubble of, hey, get out now, like he gave me his warning. They usually give you a warning. Or he just didn't give me a warning. One of these two things is the possibility. And then came down and threatened to shoot me. So I'm like, oh, crap. And I hit the run out button, which is in the upper left. Just get the hell out right now. Marco didn't. He refused to run. He just stood there and I counted in my head about 3 seconds as I'm like, and I hit the run button again, I hit the run button again, and then he got shot in the face and died. This is on day 17. I really don't know what happened there exactly and why he couldn't run. Maybe I should just manually run. Maybe he would have shot me even if he manually run. But what happened next was Bruno said about how he was livid and he was going to go get revenge. So I'm like, okay. So I sent Bruno the next night to kill the guy. He actually damages him, but ends up getting shot. So the other person, the guy who shot him, is now hurt. Then Pavel, the only surviving member, says, I will never forgive, Bruno's killer. I will never forgive Marco's killer. Never. I will hunt them down to the ends of the earth. So I'm like, okay. I send Pavel after them with my hatchet. Now, what happened next was pretty clearly a bug. The guy was over here in a room, and I'm going up a staircase, and we didn't even have line of sight on each other. And then as my guy is climbing, not staircase, excuse me, wrong word, ladder. As Pavel is climbing up the ladder, I hear a gunshot, don't see anything, and Pavel just falls over dead. Unless you can just shoot through the floor, I'm pretty sure that was a flat-out bug. Regardless, that was the end of my final playthrough. I probably could have kept playing. I actually kind of think I might keep playing this in the future in my spare time that I have so much of. Maybe I'll stream it sometime. That actually sounds kind of a good idea. But either way, we all died like dogs for no reason. See you around, guys.